Welcome to this special presentation of the Coral Ridge Hour with Dr. D. James Kennedy. Taking Liberties, the Betrayal of Our Heritage.
In the summer of 1776, our forefathers gathered in Philadelphia to create one of the most influential documents in the history of the world, the Declaration of Independence. Today, I want you to see a very special program about the Christian foundations of that document and of American liberty itself. Also, the very real and ominous threats that exist to that liberty in our generation. This program is based on one that we first aired in the spring of 1992. But since that time, we have witnessed several disturbing events that have taken place across this country. You will see one such case that took place recently in the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. So stay tuned. This is a program I wish every Christian in America could see.
Seattle, Washington. Second graders are asked at Thanksgiving to write what they're thankful for. A little girl writes that she's thankful Jesus died for her. The teacher tells the girl that's unacceptable. She has to write something else, something non-religious. Tulsa, Oklahoma. A little boy prays silently before taking a math test. The teacher sends him to the principal, who demands that the little boy write 500 times, "I will not pray in school." Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A high school valedictorian is not allowed to give credit where credit is due by sharing an encouraging word of testimony to her classmates at graduation. She is prohibited from telling them to believe in God, even though previous year's valedictorians were allowed to tell their classmates to believe in themselves and human potential.
Now these, on the face of them, seem clearly extreme illustrations. But the problem is there's so many of these sort of stories running around that you begin to think, well, they're extreme in the sense of they're ludicrous and ridiculous, but they're not uncommon.
A striking example of the threat to our religious liberties is what has been happening over the last few years to the LaPorte Church of Christ in Fort Collins, Colorado.
We're going to talk some tonight about righteousness and nations. The Bible says in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people. Did you hear it? Righteousness exalts a nation. How often do we hear people say, what's happened to our country? What's going on?
The threat to our religious liberties also spreads to the remotest areas of our nation. Broadcasting from his 1,200-acre ranch here in southeast Wyoming, Pete Peters will tell you he often feels both literally and figuratively like a lone cry in the wilderness. Peters was outraged when a gay rights amendment was introduced 5 years ago by the City Council of Fort Collins, Colorado. The LaPorte Church of Christ, where he pastors, is just on the outskirts.
Fort Collins City Council, in a pusillanimous politician fashion, rather than just kill it at that point in time, which they could have, they put it out for a general election in the fall of 1988.
Peters went to the airwaves opposing the measure, but when state officials saw a newspaper ad his church sponsored opposing the pro-homosexual ordinance, they decided to take action against the pastor and his church. Peters' attorney, Frazier Marks, explains.
The county clerk in Fort Collins, Colorado, sent a letter to Pastor Peters and the church notifying them that indeed, since they had purchased this ad, they were deemed to be a political committee under the Colorado Campaign Reform Act, and as such were required, therefore, to file certain documents disclosing contributions and basically comply with the terms of the statute. This pastor and this congregation took an issue that was contrary to God's law. Sodomy is contrary to God's law, and they have a First Amendment right to simply express that. And I believe that they were singled out for persecution and prosecution because of that.
After refusing to register his church, Peters received another letter. This time, Colorado Secretary of State Natalie Meyer demanded he register his church as a political action committee. After again refusing to yield to the state, Peters and the LaPorte Church of Christ were slapped with a $10 a day fine until they agreed to comply. This past February, several years and thousands of dollars in penalties later, the state brought the incident to a head.
We watched them steal $3,800 out of our checking account. We watched them steal thousands of dollars of property out of our church building. February 26, 1993, they came into our churchyard with 6 sheriff cruisers with armed men in them and pulled into our yard with a loading van and backed it up to the door of our church and began to empty out the contents of our church.
Congregation member Dan Junker recalls that day.
I'd never seen a church violated or a church building or the church, the people were really being violated by the theft of all this property. And I told the police officers I felt they were thieves in uniform.
On top of that, they posted signs all across our building saying, "Keep out, seized by order of the court." And they seized our building. At that point, it was no longer an issue of property. It was an issue of freedom of assembly and freedom of worship. We'd been meeting in that church building for 17 years. And I have to say that was the first time in my life that I really had to look and see that I'd never been grateful for this freedom I had always taken for granted.
Attorney Marks met with Peters to prepare a strategy, but within the week, the state agreed to unlock the church doors for worship and to return confiscated printing equipment. The remaining property was auctioned off as settlement for the unpaid fines. Although many Christians would disagree with some aspects of Pastor Peters' theology, most would agree with his resolve to stand for his faith.
The real issue, when you distill it down, was who gets to be God, Jesus Christ or the state of Colorado?
We're seeing around the country, this is just one example of it, the confrontation between God's law, which is supreme, and the law from which our entire constitutional form of government derived. We're seeing that law pitted against man's law. And so when this happens, there's going to be problems.
The limits of tyrants really are going to be prescribed by the courage of Christian men.
When individuals step out from their church and become the salt, bitter as it may be, but become the actual salt, and purify, and attempt to purify, and occupy this land of ours, and resist, every now and again they win. And this case here in LaPorte, Colorado is a classic example of that. In the end, we won. Basically, we never signed up as a political committee. We never submitted ourselves to the regulation of a statute that was misapplied from the first place. And in so doing, set a precedent that I think will stand and can be used by other churches in Colorado. Now, I don't know what support Pastor Peters received during that time, but he should be getting a whole lot of letters right now from churches around Colorado for taking a stand against the Secretary of State on this issue. And God bless him for that.
What has happened to the LaPorte Church of Christ is not an isolated incident. Indeed, there is a concerted effort to strip away our religious liberties in this country. An analogy to the threat to our freedoms can be found in the Statue of Liberty.